Dottie Jean Kirk has a real gift with her storytelling. And she gives that gift to us because she welcomes us into her world. And we feel like we're walking right beside her. So, let's welcome Dottie Jean Kirk to the stage.
Thank you. One of my favorite quotes is Spalding Gray's quote. He says, one of the ways, if you want to reincarnate, tell your story. Well, I've been trying to do that over the last few years, but not to reincarnate myself, but to reincarnate all those incredible people that have been in my life. Those of you who saw my first show, Hold Still, I Can't See Myself, I talked about my father, my grandmother, my mother. And this week, Connie always tells me to pay attention to the dreams I have, around a show. This past week, I had a dream. I dreamed that I came to the theater, and I was a little bit rushed and a little hectic, and I went backstage, off stage where I was tonight. And there, backstage, were waiting for me my mother, my father, my brother, my grandmother. So I went running out onto the stage to grab Connie. I said, Connie, come here. You got to come back. You got to meet them. So that's what I want to say to you tonight. Come on. I want you to meet them. I had 6 parents when I was growing up. 6 parents all at one time. There were my mother and father, my biological parents, of course. Then there were 2 sisters who lived down the street. Mrs. Butcher, we called her Butcher for short, and her sister Louise. They were older, about my grandmother's age, close in age to my grandmother. And they were widows, and they didn't have any children. And then completing the 6 were my mother's older sister, Virgie, and her husband, Bill. They didn't have any children either. That was the 6 of them made up the village that raised me and my brother. And we were a pretty, very tight-knit family group. They did everything that parents would do. They guided us, they disciplined us, they taught us, and they loved us. We were such a tight family group, in fact, that when Christmas morning came and my brother and I were eager to get into the living room to see what Santa had brought us, we had to wait till all 6 parents were present. Only then could we go rushing into the living room. Each person brought a different skill set and different abilities to the role of parenting. They all knew different things. Miss Butcher taught me to cook. Louise taught me to tell a good joke. My mother taught me how to give a party. My father taught me how to use my brain. Virgie taught me how to tell a moving story. And Bill taught me how to have a happy childhood. All of us lived within about a 2-block area. I could get to Virgie and Bill's in 5 minutes if I went by sidewalk. But I knew the back way through the backyards, and so all I had to do was climb a fence and skinny through a hedge, and I could be at their door in seconds flat. And I spent so much time with them. I spent more time in their home than I did in my own home. In the summer, I ate lunch with them every day. We didn't call it lunch, we called it dinner. Then we called dinner supper. Every day. And then on weekends, I spent most Saturdays with them. And on Saturday, our typical day would be Bill would go down to one of the dime stores in town and visit the candy and nut counter. And he'd buy Virgie's favorite candy, which was, remember those jellied orange slices? And peppermint patties. And then for us, he would buy a bag of mixed nuts, which would still be hot when he got them home. Then Virgie would pack a picnic basket of fried chicken and potato salad. And as the sun was just beginning to drop, we'd get in Bill's 1948 Chevrolet and head to the drive-in. Salisbury had 3 drive-ins. This was let's see, I was 4 or 5 years. This was not yet the 50s. This was the late 40s. It had 3 drive-ins, and we'd usually always pick the one that had a Western. If not a Western, then a comedy. We'd always try to get to the drive-in early, but no matter how early we got there, there'd always be a line of cars to get in. And admission fee was by the car. It was just a flat rate per car. So most cars had a lot of kids in the back seat and everything. But I didn't have to sit in the back seat. No. Bill had made for me a special little riser seat. It was about 8 inches tall or so, just fit me, and he covered it with the same upholstery fabric that was in that 1948 Chevrolet. And that Chevrolet had a bench seat, I guess you call it. It was flat. There was no console then. So he put that seat right in between him and Virgie. And there I would be, eye level with them, and we would watch the movie. And we would, I don't know if those of you many of you may not have been to the drive-ins at that time, but the layout was a little unique. You would go in, and there'd be about 20 rows for cars, and the rows would be terraced. And actually, when you parked your car, you'd be parking on a bit of an incline so that you could see the screen. And you parked next to a speaker pole, a pole that had a clumsy metal speaker box on it, and Bill would take it off the stand and bring it in and hang it on the window of the car. In the middle of the parking area, there was a little concrete block building that housed a projector and the concession stand. And all through the evening, somebody would walk by with a little tray with a strap around his neck selling soft drinks and ice cream. So there we would be, 3 peas and a Chevy pod, just eating and enjoying the movie. Bill putting me in that seat with him, for me, was a symbol of how much he viewed that we were family. And in fact, he always called me the daughter they never had. And they treated me like family, and I felt like their daughter. And they would take me to his family reunions when they went, and I was treated as their daughter there. When they went to visit family, I would often go with them. So in every way, Bill was like a dad to me. He was a dad in a way that my own father wasn't. My own father had a lot of family responsibilities, a family business. He worked 7 days a week, long hours. In many ways, he was just not terribly involved in my childhood. But luckily, I had Bill, and he stepped into that role of everyday dad. Bill taught me all those things that my daddy couldn't teach me. He taught me to ride a bike. He taught me to skate. He taught me to shoot marbles. He taught me to swing a baseball bat. And he taught me to read road signs from a very early age when we'd be just riding along to tell what the road signs were. And he taught me to drive. I can remember one summer evening, the summer I turned 14, and I had just finished supper at their house. And they ate early, so when I say finished supper, it was probably 6 o'clock, and we were done. So Bill looked at me and he said, "Well, would you like to go learn to drive now?" "Yes, yes," I said. So we went out. He said that they were finishing I-85 going through Salisbury, and it wasn't yet finished. And he said that it hadn't been turned over to the authorities yet. And he did not believe that law enforcement had any jurisdiction to give us any tickets or anything. So we would go over to I-85 that was still unfinished, and I'd learn to drive. But first we went out and sat in his driveway. He took me out to his beautiful 1955 blue and white Chevy, and he had me get in the driver's seat, and he got in the passenger side, and he was such a good teacher. First he explained, what everything was, and then he told me how the gears worked. And he made me visualize that little H, and how to identify when I'm in neutral, and then first, and then second. And he had me just practicing in the car with no engine on or anything, with the my foot on the clutch, and he told me what the pedals were for, and he described what I would have to do with the clutch and how important it was to ease up on the clutch while you're giving it some gas so you don't stall and lurch and everything. And he told me, in general, everything in the car and how it worked. And then the last thing he had me do was practice the turn signals. Now, I know you're sitting there thinking, oh, yeah, Dottie Jean, you were there pushing up to turn right, pushing down to turn left. No, for those of you who haven't perhaps driven a car from the 1950s, we didn't have turn signals. We had our arms. So if we wanted to go left, we stuck our arm out like that. If we wanted to go right, it was like this. And if we were going to stop, it would go like that. So after we got all that settled, Bill said, okay, start the engine. I felt just like I was at some important race or something. And I did exactly. He was so calm. He was such a good teacher. I did exactly what I'd been taught to do, what he told me to do. I put it from neutral into first. I eased up ever so gently on that clutch at the same time depressing on the gas. Oh, it got off to such a smooth start. It didn't jolt. It didn't stall out or anything. We drove down his driveway, and he was instructing me all the time about coming up to a stop sign, this, that, or the other. Finally, we got out onto the entrance to the highway, and there wasn't a single car there. There was equipment on the side of the road and in the median and stuff like that, but no other cars. A few weeks later, it would have been swarming with cars and trucks and everything, but that night it was deserted. So he let me drive for 15 or 20 minutes, Then he told me to turn around, stop, turn around, and go home, directed me the whole time. Finally got back into his, drove up into his driveway, and I parked it into the garage. And then I took a breath. And I went into, I remember so much the experience of that. It was, at first I remember the steering wheel. It was much bigger than steering wheels we had today. I don't know if it's because I was younger, because they were really bigger, but it seemed gigantic. And it was made out of a real beautiful hard plastic. I don't know if it was Bakelite or what it was, and I remember it had little pie crust-like indentations on the backside of the steering wheel that you could put your fingers in. And then right in the center of the steering wheel was a chrome-colored rim, just a little rim for a horn that you could use. And then at the very center was a round medallion that said Chevrolet. And driving that car, I just felt at one with that car. I was in the moment. I was following Bill's instructions. I was doing everything. I've heard people talk about peak experiences in their life. Well, that was a peak experience day for me, the very first one I had had. And I went running into the house to tell Virgie, oh, I was driving. And Bill came in and bragged on me and told me how good I had done, and I was the best student he'd ever had. And he'd taught a lot of people to drive, my mother included. But it was still 2 more years before I could get my learner's permit and drive. But when I did get my learner's permit, he taught me. And I still do some of the same things that he taught me to do. I remember them. For example, if an oncoming car at night won't dim their lights, don't stare at the lights. Look at the white line on the far side of the road. Don't focus on the lights. He said, if you make a left turn like an intersection, don't turn your wheels until you're actually going to make that turn. If you start to turn your wheels and you're just sitting there, somebody could ram you from behind and push you into oncoming traffic. And one thing he told me is obsolete today, but I still do it. If you have to come to a sudden stop and you have a passenger, put your arm out like that to hold them in place. So I still do that today if I have to make a sudden stop. Even though we have I sling my arm over there and try to hold my passenger in, although that's not really necessary. Bill and my father both wanted me to succeed and do well at school. They thought that was important. And I remember once I was in the 5th grade, and in the middle of the school year, I had gotten a bad report card. And I was just bored with school. I hated it, and my grades showed it. So Bill proposed a deal to me. He said, Dottie Jean, if you get 5 A's, actually, there were 5 superiors back then, but I'll say A's, 5 A's, I'll give you $5. He said, now if you get 4 A's, you won't get anything. And if you get 6 A's, you still only get $5. So the most, he was limiting his risk there. So the most I could get was $5. But boy, I accepted that deal. I had never had $5 in once, ever. I had an allowance that was 50 cents a week. But every Saturday when I got my allowance, I went out to the dime store shopping around for what I could buy, and I spent it. But I wanted $5. I could think of so many things I could buy with that. So I'd come home from school, and I'd start on my homework right away, study really hard. And then at night, I'd often go over to Bill and Virgie's for supper. And after supper, I'd keep working and studying and memorizing and doing all these things. One night, as I was studying, Bill came and he asked me, would you mind if I studied with you? And I said, no. He said, I didn't have a chance to go to school. I only went through the 7th grade. And I've always felt sort of ashamed of that. And I've always wanted to learn more, so this is my opportunity. So we sat there, the two of us, and studied together, learning together, actually. I don't know how I have it, but I do have a pad of paper with his handwriting on which he had written the states and the state capitals. That's what we were studying that year. Well, as the report card period was coming to a close, I got more and more obsessive. All I could think about was this $5 and getting my 5 A's. I was just beside myself with what I get home, what if I don't get it, and everything. Well, finally the day came when we were going to get our report cards. And all day in school I was fidgeting and couldn't pay attention, I couldn't focus. So at the end of the school day, our teacher, Mrs. Parrish, started handing out the report cards. And we could, as soon as she gave us our report card, we were free to go home. So she called out the names, Barbara Brown, Bill Yates, Lynn Hudson, and not my name. Come on, I'm waiting my report card. Finally, it was down to me and my best friend Dolores getting our report card. And we were there left with the teacher, and I finally had it in my hands, and I looked at it, and I made exactly 5 A's. I had done it. As we were leaving, Mrs. Parrish, our teacher, said to Dolores, "Now, Dolores, hold Dottie Jean down on the way home so she doesn't fly away." Years later, I learned that Bill had gotten a little worried about my obsession. He thought that he was worried about what might happen if I didn't make 5 A's. He thought that whole thing might backfire. And I found out that he had actually called Mrs. Parrish, my teacher, to express concern. Had he created a monster and what would happen and everything? So I don't know whether I actually earned those 5 A's or if Bill's call just pushed me over that edge. Bill tried to teach me. He had a lot of things. He was successful at teaching me to drive. But I was a failure at learning one of his other great passions in life, which was fishing. Bill loved to fish. And he loved to fish whether it was with a bamboo pole off of a riverbank, or surf fishing at the coast, or deep sea fishing in a boat. But he wanted me to experience that thrill of fishing, that enjoyment that he got from it. So one afternoon in one summer vacation, I think I was about in the 4th grade or something, he took me and a few other people were going, and we went out to a farm owned by a family friend where they had a pond with fish in it and everything. And so we were going to fish, and Bill got me a bamboo pole. Luckily, he put the bait on it for me because he knew I'd be a little squeamish about putting that worm on there. And then he told me, how to look to see if I had a bite, and watch that little bobber thing, and what to do if a fish would bite, and how to just sort of, don't jerk real fast, but bring it up a certain way. And so then we sat, and I sat and sat and sat. Everybody else around me was catching fish, but I had nary a nibble. And I was getting bitten by mosquitoes. It was hot. I wanted to go home. I didn't really like fishing. What is the point of this? And so at one point, I had to go back to the house to go to the bathroom. And when I came back, Bill said, "Oh, Dottie Jean, come over here." Bill was watching my pole, minding my pole while I was gone. He said, "I think you got a bite. I think you got a fish on that." He said, "Pull it up and see." And I pulled it up, and sure enough, there was this fish flopping around out there on the end of that line. And then everybody started laughing. Then I realized Bill, while I had been back at the house going to the bathroom, he had put that fish on that line so that I could get the joy of catching a fish. Now, what I'm going to tell you next is going to sound unbelievable and a little pathetic, really. But it was about, when I was in my 30s, Mama and Daddy and Bill went to the Outer Banks to go fishing, and I drove from Atlanta, where I was living at the time, to join them. We were surf fishing. Well, true to form, I wasn't catching any fish. And everybody seemed to be catching fish, and I went to do something else, got distracted, went to the bathroom. When I came back, Bill played that same trick on me. Fishing wasn't Bill's first passion. His first passion was cars. He loved cars, and he took great, great pride in his cars, but not just any car, mind you. Bill was a Chevy man. And he considered anything that wasn't Chevy, he called it an off-brand. He said, my daddy would drive a Ford. He said, "I don't know why your daddy doesn't get rid of that off-brand car." So nothing was worth driving to Bill but a Chevrolet. And he worked at the Chevy dealer. Bill was a body mechanic. They work, for those of you who might not know, they work on wrecks. They paint cars. He painted and fixed up cars. And he might have been, I'm pretty sure he was, the best body mechanic in North Carolina. People came from all over wanting Bill to work on his car. He did such an incredible job. And so he worked at the Chevy dealer as his job, but he also at night and on weekends he worked on his projects. My aunt and uncle, Bill and Virgie, never had a new car. They always had a better than new car, what I would call a Bill-built car. Bill looked for recent late model Chevrolets, always a Chevrolet, that had been totaled by the insurance company. But totaled because of the bodywork. The frame was still good, and the engine was fine. And he would buy it for, very little money, and then he would work for months restoring that car in his spare time. And the day would come for the unveiling, and my aunt and me, maybe some other cousins, would go down to the garage, eager to see this car, because we knew what it looked like when it went into he had plenty of before pictures of what this car looked like when he bought it. I mean, it looked like it had been hit by a train or something. And he worked up on the second floor, and it had a curved ramp like you sometimes see at parking garages that went up to the second floor. So he'd go up to the second floor, and he would drive that car down that curved ramp. We could see that beautiful grill coming down as he drove it down. It was always beautiful and shiny. And it just seemed to float right out onto the street there. And we all just were in awe of it. It was beautiful. It was an incredibly gorgeous car. And we would ooh and ah and talk about the beauty of that car. And it was. It was more beautiful than it had been when it was brand new on the showroom. Because Bill took great pains with it. He took no shortcuts. He did everything. He liked his cars to be perfect. He liked them all to be shiny always, never any dents, anything like that. Just recently I hit a mailbox at the place where I live, and it made a little dent, and I remember mentioning to Warren here, I said, "Oh, well, it's just a car." That would not be my Uncle Bill's viewpoint, no. And he would keep that car for a while until the next total wreck came along that he thought he could restore. And he'd have friends and nieces and nephews and cousins lined up to buy the car that he had restored, when he got ready for the new one. So Bill loved cars, and he loved everything about cars. He loved speed in particular. He loved the stock car races. And he went as often as we could because they weren't too far from where we lived. And when he couldn't go, he listened to them on the radio. I can remember being at their house on a Saturday afternoon, and Bill would have the radio on listening to car races. To me, there was just nothing to listen to. I mean, I would just have to leave. I couldn't understand it. I mentioned to a friend, I said, "Can you imagine anything worse than that?" She said yes. She said she had a friend who had a 33 and a third LP of the sounds of motorcycle races. That if ever anybody showed the least interest in that, he would get it out and play it. So he also liked to drive fast. In fact, I remember being in the car with him one time when he got a speeding ticket, but that did nothing to slow him down. We used to go for rides on Sunday afternoon, and we would either go to the mountains or we'd go see some of his family in Gastonia or Shelby. But a lot of times we just drove around Rowan County where we lived, on some of the rural roads, just enjoy. He'd like to drive. We liked to ride around. And when we'd be getting ready to go home, Bill would always ask me, "Dottie Jean, which way do you want to go home?" And I'd always say, "The Bridgeway, the Bridgeway." And I'd be standing on, this wasn't a drive-in, so that special seat was just for the drive-in. I'd be standing on that hump in the back seat, floorboard of the 48 Chevy. And so the Bridgeway was this rural road in Rowan County that had a wooden bridge. And it was made with wooden planks that ran that way. And the bridge had a ramp up about 4 or 5 feet, and then it had a flat section of the bridge, and then it had a ramp down. So when we went home the Bridgeway, Bill would stop about 200 feet short of that bridge. And he'd make sure no cars were coming in either direction. And then he would press on that gas and we'd be off. And we'd be picking up speed. And I was holding on for dear life because we didn't have seat belts. And he would hit that ramp and we would be catapulted and we'd be flying through the air. And then we'd land on the asphalt on the other side. And all three of us would just be laughing. We loved that experience. I shudder now to think about it, but at the time it was fun. Bill, what I loved most about Bill, though, was Bill and Virgie both, this is for both of them, is the great joy and happiness they brought to Christmas. They always, Santa Claus would bring me lots of presents. Clothes, books, toys, different things. Bill and Virgie would give me one present, but it was always the best present. They knew somehow what I wanted before I did. I wouldn't have even thought to ask for these presents. I can remember in somewhere around kindergarten, maybe the first grade, they gave me a cowgirl outfit. And probably all those westerns we used to go to at the drive-in. Maybe I even wore that cowgirl outfit when we went to the drive-in. But I can remember the little fringed vest and the skirt. I was disappointed, though. No 6-shooters, no holsters. When I was in the 3rd grade, they gave me a Cinderella watch. The movie had come out, and I loved Cinderella. And it was the very first watch I'd ever had, and I loved it. The watch came in a little plastic slipper. I just loved that watch, and I remember I wore it to school one day, and I put it in my desk. We had those desks that sort of lift up, and I left it in there overnight. And when I went back the next day, it wasn't there. I remember I went crying to Bill and Virgie, my Cinderella watch. But they wouldn't buy me another one. If it were me and my child, I'd go out and buy them another Cinderella watch probably. Maybe a lot of parents would today. They didn't know. They wanted me to learn the value of things and that carelessness had consequences, and they weren't going to buy me another watch. When I was in the 5th grade, they gave me a Kodak Brownie Hawkeye camera. And I still remember the box. It was in a beautiful yellow box. It had a black plastic carry handle. When you opened it up, everything was packaged beautifully. It had one of those big flash attachments with flash bulbs, another anachronism. We don't have those anymore. And Apple is known for its packaging today. I think they learned it from Kodak. And the camera itself was beautiful. It was made out of Bakelite. It was a beautiful plastic. If you don't know Bakelite, it was a plastic that they used. I don't have it. I thought I had a pen. It was a plastic that it was invented in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and they used it a lot for kitchen things and jewelry. And it was a footnote to Bakelite. In 1993, the National Chemical Society declared Bakelite a historical chemical, national historical chemical for its fact that it was the first plastic in the United States. You know, what I didn't know then, and I learned only years later, was that when we rushed into that, when all 6 parents were there and we rushed into the living room to see what Santa had brought us, I'd have a pile of things on one side of the room, my brother Sonny would have a pile of things on the other. And in the middle, in the centerpiece of all that, there'd usually be a shiny candy apple red tricycle or a bicycle or a wagon or a pedal car. What I didn't know is that they were not made in Santa's workshops. They were made in Bill's workshop. All year long, Bill collected rusted out, mangled, abandoned toys like bicycles, tricycles, all those things that nobody wanted. And all year long, secretly, in his secret Santa workshop, he worked on restoring them. And then we would get them at Christmas. And the amazing thing is, he not only did this for me, he did this for a lot of his other nieces and nephews around that same period of time. And there was a family that moved in down the street from us, young, very young, like 20 years old, single woman, mother. She had been married, but single at that time, mom with 4 children. And they were as poor can be. They had nothing. And Bill and Virgie became their Santa. And not only did they give them clothes at Christmas and candy and treats and everything like that, but every Christmas for several years, each of those 4 children got a toy, a bicycle, tricycle, always one of those things with wheels, because Bill was partial to wheels. Always one of those things that he had restored. So that always made him so happy. He got such joy from doing that. I don't know actually who was happier, Bill or those of us who benefited from his great generosity. You know, over the years I grew up, I went to high school, graduated high school, went to college, and Bill continued to be a big influence in my life. He and Virgie would come over on weekends to my college and take a bunch of us out to eat, always as a treat. And then I entered the graduate school, and Bill continued to change my life. I had, Mom and Daddy had paid for my college to get me through college and 1 year of graduate school, but I was trying to finish up my master's degree, and Mom and Daddy said they couldn't do it anymore. My brother was in college. I was going to have to figure out a way to do it on my own. I had just 1 more year to finish, do my thesis, some more coursework. And so I took a part-time job as a telephone operator at Southern Bell. But I was still having a hard time making it. You know, I thought I'm going to have to drop out. I can't make it. I'm going to have to give up this schooling. But one day Virgie and Bill came over to take me out to lunch, which was not uncommon. And after lunch, Bill said, well, you know, we really wanted to help with your college education, but your mom and daddy said no, that they could do it. He said, but things have changed now. And Virgie and I want you to have this. And he handed me an envelope in which there was a check for $1,500. This was 1966. I could live an entire year on $1,500. My rent was $75 a month, electricity about $5 a month, gas and food $30, $40 a month. That check enabled me to finish that school year out, finish my master's thesis, and get my degree. I finished it. I was 24 years old, thanks to Bill and Virgie and my parents, of course, who had taken me that far as well. For the next 20 years, I spent the next 20 years developing my career, and I lived in several different cities. And I stayed close to all my, I went home for holidays. They came to visit me. I stayed close to all 6 parents. Butcher and Louise were the first to die. They died in the mid to late 70s. My father died in 1985, and my mother died in 1987, just 2 years after my father, when I was 44. The only two parents left at that time were Bill and Virgie, of the six. And after Mama died, Bill, something happened. He wanted to move into my life in a more strong role as a parent. He started being very parental with me and wanting to involve himself in my life and my financial affairs and different things. And he started asking me a lot of questions like, who would take care of me if something happened to me? Did I have life insurance? Did I have a will? And did I have a power of attorney and all those other kind of things? And I knew he was hinting that he wanted to be involved in that part of my life in somehow. He wanted to step in where I had no longer Mama or Daddy. What he didn't know is that Daddy had never taken an interest in any of those aspects of my life, and neither had Mama. And so I kept thinking, well, why is he asking me and wanting to kind of insert himself in these matters? I was 44. And at first I thought, well, he was born in 1912. And I thought when single women then, when he was a young man, they relied on their father or their uncle or their brother or whatever. They didn't typically leave home and go to another city, at least not in the South. But years later, I figured it was something else. I think that Bill had been waiting in the wings, really, to be my father in a sense that he had never been able to be before. And he wanted some affirmation that he was that. He wanted it on paper. He wanted something legal about it that would say, look, this is my daughter and I'm her power of attorney or whatever it was. And I figured out that was, I had always, I'd been evasive about it, never really addressed the issues because I thought, I didn't want to say what seemed obvious to me, that I was going to outlive him. But it wasn't that he was wanting, to inherit anything or do anything like that. In fact, it reminded me of the movie The Wizard of Oz, where at the end, one of them, he got to prove that he was brave, I think, is his testimonial. Bill wanted some sort of written testimonial that not only was I the daughter he never had, but he really was my father in a sense. In 1993, my partner and I moved back to Western North Carolina, close enough that I could see Virgie and Bill often, and I did. I often went to see them and stayed in touch, went to visit. But in 1999, I wanted to move to Southern California. And I wanted to for several reasons, but one is my brother lived there. And he was my only sibling, and the last connection with Mom and Daddy, it was just us now. So my partner and I decided we would move to the desert of California. And I remember calling Bill to tell him that we were going to be moving. And he got really upset. In fact, he got angry with me. And he had never been angry with me before. And he said, I'll never see you again. He said, you'll never be back here. I tried to reassure him and said, of course I'll be back. I'll be coming back to see you and Virgie. I'll be back often. And so we moved in early June of 1999 to California. And things were different with Bill now. There was hurt and anger. There was a rift between us. I knew he was hurt. I would call him on the phone to talk to him, but he wasn't the same to me that he had been in the past. And I didn't really know how to address it or how to deal with it. The Christmas of 1999, I stayed in California because it was the first Christmas there. I wanted to be in my home, and I didn't want to travel back. That hurt him even more because I'd always been home, if not at Christmas on the day itself, always during the holiday at some point. And, I thought we would have time to work this out. I was a little bit naive. He was 87 at that time, and he always seemed a lot younger than that. Bill didn't retire from the Chevy place till he was 75. And even then, he continued painting and fixing cars, and he moved like a young person, and he seemed young. But in March of '99, I got a call from my cousin now, and she said that the very next day, Bill was going into Charlotte Presbyterian to have heart surgery. It was pretty serious heart surgery. And I thought, what? Tomorrow? And he didn't call me? He didn't tell me? And so I was on an assignment in Dallas, and I was able to get on a flight out very early the next morning, and I landed in Charlotte late morning. I called my cousin to see how he was doing. She was still back with my aunt, and she said the surgery had not gone well, that it did not look good, is what she said. So I rented a car and drove to the hospital just as fast as Bill would have driven if he had been driving. And I got there and I went up to the intensive care unit, and the nurse pointed me, to his cubicle. And I went in there to see him, and he was unconscious, unaware that I was there as far as I knew. And he looked so fragile and old. He looked his 87 years. He had never looked that old to me before. And he was so white and pale. And he had on this hospital gown, and it had fallen down and slipped down around his arm. And he just looked so vulnerable there. That skin right there on his shoulder was so white, it was about like alabaster. And I pulled it up around him again because I knew he wouldn't want to be exposed that way in the hospital. And I could look up and see, I could hear the machines. I could look up and see he was connected to all kinds of things. But I remembered what my mother's doctor had told me when she was dying. He said, hearing is the last thing to go. So I started talking to Bill, and I told him how much I loved him and what an important role he had filled in my life. And that if it hadn't been for him, I wouldn't have had much of a childhood. That he had brought so much joy and happiness to my childhood, and that he had taught me so much, and that I was so grateful for it. And I just told him that I loved him, and that he was the dad I had never had, just as I was the daughter he had never had. And the last thing I told him, I said, don't worry, I will do everything in my power to take care of Virgie, his wife, who was still living and would need help. And at that point, I detected a visible difference. Things got quieter. The machines weren't making those same noises. And I looked up, and I saw that heart monitor line had gone flat. Bill had died. And I don't know whether Bill was waiting for me to get there, thinking that somehow, even though he didn't tell me, that somehow I would get there. I hope that's the case. I hope I said the right things to him so that he would know that I loved him, and that he meant so much to me, and that he was such a bright light in my life. He did shine. Thank you.